Imagine hearing this boast right after a brutal battle. Quote, "We didn't just kill the tiger of Mysore, we humiliated him by stealing his most prized personal possessions. I am Major General Baird, and taking Tipu Sultan's ring wasn't about victory, it was about erasing his legacy in front of the world." End quote. Wow. I mean, imagine standing over a fallen king, and instead of just, claiming a military victory, the victor makes this incredibly calculated decision to strip away his personal jewelry just to completely humiliate an entire legacy. That's the visceral and honestly intense scenario presented by our source material today. So, welcome everyone. Today we're jumping straight into a really fascinating, deeply analytical explainer of the historical text True Itihas. Specifically, we're looking at a section called Plunder and Power, unpacking the True Itihas explainer. Now, as always, my goal here is absolutely not to take sides. We're just here to impartially unpack the arguments this text makes about colonial resource extraction and cultural dominance. We're actually going to break down how the source connects something as deeply personal as stealing a ruler's ring all the way to the massive, continent-wide rollout of the Indian railway system. It's a really structured argument, so let's just get right into it.
Section 1, the tiger's stolen ring. Okay, let's dive into this.
To really understand the source's argument, we have to start at the micro level. When the British defeated Tipu Sultan, the famously fierce tiger of Mysore, Major General Arthur Baird personally stood over his body and stripped this massive jewel-encrusted gold ring right off the fallen king's finger. But notice the contrast the source draws here. It argues that this move was absolutely not about financial gain. I mean, the British didn't really need the gold, right? Instead, this act is framed strictly as a psychological trophy. Taking that ring was all about parading it back in England to prove their ultimate dominance. It was a calculated, deliberate move meant to erase the pride of a fierce Indian ruler in front of the entire world.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the argument scales up. The text explicitly asserts that the theft of Tipu Sultan's ring wasn't just a one-off, isolated incident. Far from it. Instead, it argues that the British had a systematic, deeply calculated habit of stealing sacred heritage, specifically to break the spirit of the people. It wasn't just about disarming a population, it was about totally demoralizing them by taking the very items they held most sacred.
Section 2. Looting Sacred Heritage.
And this brilliantly illustrates the point, because the source actually expands its scope way beyond Tipu Sultan. It details how the British allegedly targeted the artifacts of some of India's absolute most legendary warriors. Take a look at the data we pulled directly from the text's examples. We've got deeply revered artifacts on one side and then their current locations, which are literally thousands of miles away. First up, we see the legendary sword of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. This is an artifact so revered, the text notes it was said to be a direct blessing from the goddess Tulja Bhavani herself. And where is it now? A London museum. Then, the source points to Maharana Pratap, the great Rajput king. His actual battle swords, his shield, his armor, they're currently logged in the British Museum under the Rajput War Collection. And finally, the famous Wagnach, which also belonged to Shivaji Maharaj, currently sits in the Royal Collection Trust.
Just to really emphasize why taking these specific items was so utterly demoralizing, the source highlights the history of the Wagnach. For those who might not know, the text defines the Wagnach as deadly tiger claws. This is the exact incredibly intimate weapon famously used by Shivaji Maharaj in a brilliant tactical move to tear open Afzal Khan's stomach. By highlighting this super visceral history, the source makes the case that taking an item with such a legendary, triumphant cultural history and just locking it away in a foreign trust, well, that is the ultimate form of psychological dominance.
But the True Itihas text doesn't just stop at cultural artifacts. It builds a really fascinating thematic bridge here. It argues that this strategy of psychological dominance naturally scaled up into massive physical and economic control. The theft wasn't just about weapons or jewelry. It was actually the blueprint for a giant, systematic plan to completely drain and control the entire Indian continent.
Section 3. The True Railway Motive. Let's move to and see how this builds.
Okay, 1853. This is the year the very first passenger train ran from Boribandar to Thane. In a lot of standard historical narratives, this moment is framed as a huge turning point of modernization, right? Like a gift of infrastructure to the subcontinent. However, the source material we're unpacking today heavily, and I mean heavily, disputes that framing.
According to the text, the motivations behind this infrastructure were just far from benevolent public service. The source points directly to Lord Dalhousie, a guy often referred to as the father of Indian railways, while the text labels him the so-called father and heavily asserts that his rollout of the trains was driven purely by quote-unquote colonial greed.
Basically, the source is saying it simply wasn't built for the benefit of the local population at all.
So the crucial point is exactly how this colonial greed functioned practically. The text outlines 3 explicit, calculated reasons for the railway's construction, and this shifts the narrative entirely from public transit to total resource extraction. First, the text claims the goal was to quickly move Indian raw materials, stuff like cotton, coal, and grain, straight to the ports. Second, the ultimate destination for those materials was to keep the factories back in England running day and night. And third, on a strictly military level, the tracks were built to move British soldiers at lightning speed across the massive continent to crush any local rebellions before they could even gain momentum. The infrastructure, the source argues, was really just a larger, mechanized version of taking Tipu Sultan's ring. It was about efficient looting and maintaining absolute control.
Section 4. A legacy of extraction.
Think about the incredible journey we've just tracked through this source material. We started with this really intimate moment, literally stealing a ring off a fallen king, and traced that exact same underlying motive all the way up to a continent-wide rollout of train tracks. This totally captures the core juxtaposition of the true Itihas argument. On one side, you have the proclaimed historical purpose, that museums preserve artifacts as gifts to global heritage, and that railways were gifts of public transit to a developing nation. But then on the other side, you have the source's argued actual purpose, that these actions represent a continuous timeline of systematic looting, cultural humiliation, and rapid military suppression. By placing these side by side, the text is asking us to fundamentally reevaluate how we interpret the physical remnants of the colonial era.
And that leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative question posed by the source material. What is the true legacy of these historical artifacts sitting in foreign museums and these vast railway networks stretching across the continent? When you look at a museum display or walk through a historic train station, are you seeing preservation and progress? Or are you looking at the polished results of a giant, systematic plan to drain a civilization's wealth and spirit? It's a fascinating argument that completely challenges standard historical framing. I really hope this structured breakdown helped you clearly understand the claims being made today. Keep asking questions, keep analyzing how history is presented to you, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.